to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Jerome Slater. He is Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the State University of New York at Buffalo. He's also the author of the book Mythologies Without End, the U.S., Israel, and the Arab-Israeli conflict 1917 to 2020, available from Oxford University Press. And to my mind, if anyone is going to read just one book to understand as much as possible about the background to the Israel-Palestine conflict, they should pick up Mythologies Without End, because it is truly comprehensive. It's also very easy to read and clearly argued. Professor Jerome Slater, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you for having me.
Your book was published a few years ago now, but I was rereading it, and you make a couple of side comments that are rather prescient, or look rather prescient now in retrospect. I want to just quote from your preface. You say, "I've become convinced that Israel, with essentially blind U.S. Jewish and government support, is well along the road to both a moral and security disaster." And you say that Israel needed to come to terms with historical truth, which is a lot of what your book is about, in order to perhaps even literally save itself from an attack by fanatical terrorists. So let me start by asking you, looking back on those words, why was it that back in 2020 you thought that Israel was well along the road to a security disaster?
Well, I mean, Israelis and others were predicting that not in 2020, but in some cases in 1947 and afterward, because the reason that for a moral and security disaster is that Israel has been occupying and repressing the Palestinians from the very outset of the creation of Israel, or before the creation of Israel, in seizing territory and occupying the West Bank and so on. And there have been, as you know, a number of wars which have ended in Israeli victories, but which have only created the context for future wars. So if you regard, as I do, the root cause of this conflict not as an unending fanaticism of Arabs to destroy Israel, but rather the Israeli seizure of territory and the creation of settlements and so on, and simply, in short, the occupation and repression of the Palestinians, it was perfectly predictable that sooner or later it was going to break out in a major conflict. And of course, there have been major conflicts in the past, but they all have the same root cause.
And in fact, towards the end of the book, in your summary and conclusion sections, you have a number of quite extraordinary quotes from former IDF chiefs of staff, former Mossad directors, and generals, all warning that those who said they prioritized Israel's national security were in fact placing, these are often quite hawkish people, warning that there's an incredible quote you have from an admiral saying, it will be a catastrophe if we win. That's an interesting thing to say. Why would it be a catastrophe if we win?
If we win, it means that we've just created more resentment and hatred, and it's going to come back against us in the future. Yes, he's been saying that, but also, even more remarkable in some ways, if you ask me the question, I'll read you a few of them. There are a number of them, high officials, who said specifically that we can and should negotiate with Hamas. Now you have this incredible fanaticism. We'll get to that later on. But earlier, there were Hamas leaders who were, in some cases, hinting, in some cases more than just hinting, that they recognized that they were not going to be able to defeat Israel. They're not going to be able to achieve their maximum goal, and that they were reluctantly, but nonetheless, coming to the conclusion that they needed a settlement. And there were Israeli top officials, security officials, heads, the same situation, head of Mossad or Shin Bet, who said this is almost too good to be true. We must act on this and start negotiations with Hamas. But all Israeli prime ministers absolutely ignored and shut down a number of efforts that were being made, including by journalists and others, to start a dialogue between Hamas and Israel. So even in the case of Hamas, let alone in the larger sense of achieving a two-state solution, you have this phenomena of top leaders making these kinds of arguments.
Yeah, I mean, your book is in many ways a story of a lot of frustrating, tragic missed opportunities. The phrase missed opportunity is kind of infamous in the context of this conflict because, Abba Eban said that the Palestinians never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. But in fact, what your book does in many ways is highlight opportunities that Israel had to, if just a few concessions has been made, and you kind of enumerate the concessions that needed to be made to the Palestinians. And, we don't know for certain that there could have been a lasting peace, but there were a number of points at which this small list of concessions, if made, could probably have achieved some kind of peace settlement.
Yeah, well, since the 1967 war, the main problem has been the Israeli refusal to withdraw. Well, it withdrew from some of the territories it conquered. It withdrew from the Sinai in the context of the peace agreement with Egypt, 15 years after the end of the 1967 war. But they refused to withdraw from the West Bank. And Gaza is a little more complicated. They had settlements in Gaza. They decided, it was actually Ariel Sharon, Israel's leading military hawk, who decided that when he became prime minister, he decided that the cost of hanging on to a few settlements, mostly manned by Israeli fanatics, was too high. So they withdrew from Gaza in the sense of there's no longer any troops, any settlements on the ground in Gaza. But they control access to Gaza, they control water, they control electricity, they control the airways, and they've used this control a number of occasions, not just now, but a number of occasions in order to punish Palestinian acts of terrorism. And of course, what we're going to see now is the most devastating use of Israeli control and Israeli power over Gaza.
Let me ask you, what are the concessions that you think successive Israeli governments refused to make that, if they had been made, could have massively increased the chances that there would have been a lasting peace and avoided the current catastrophe?
Well, the main one, as I said before, is withdrawal from all the territory they conquered in 1967 and allowing the Palestinians to exercise sovereignty over that. That is primarily the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Now, there were other, in the negotiations over a two-state settlement, some of which appeared to have come pretty close. There were other issues which had to be dealt with, exactly what would happen to the Israeli settlers who were already in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. How would the water resources be divided if Israel said, well, we must keep at least some of the settlements which are right on the border between Israel and the West Bank? Then the Palestinians would get equivalent territory in the Negev, so on and so forth. And, of course, another big issue was whether Palestinians demanded, in some sense, although they didn't really demand it, the Palestinian leaders demanded that all the refugees, and they're down through the present, all the refugees from the 1948 war must be allowed to return to Israel. Well, by most reckonings, that meant 750,000. If you go in the 1960s, about 750,000 Palestinians would be. Palestinians insisted have to be returned to their homes in Israel. It was an impossible demand for all kinds of reasons. Their homes didn't exist anymore, and there was no possibility that Israel, which was determined to ensure a Jewish majority, a large Jewish majority, a Jewish state, there's no way that they were going to accept that. So we know that in practice, the main Palestinian leaders, particularly Arafat and Mohammed Abbas, the current leader, made it clear to Israel, in some cases more than just to Israel, the New York Times would have stories on it, that they're going to be prepared to accept far fewer, maybe 10, 15,000 refugees. It was the principle, Israel had to accept the principle that it bore responsibility or bore a large share of the responsibility for the creation of the refugees in the first place. So if Israel found some words it could live with, the numbers that would be admitted would not change the character of the Jewish state. Mm-hmm. But Israel would not consider that.
Yeah. So what you're saying there, as I understand it, is that what looked like, or may have looked like, and was certainly portrayed as, Palestinian intransigence and an insistence upon an unrealistic demand, which is the implementation of the full right of return. In fact, Palestinian leaders were more flexible than that narrative would suggest, and so that wouldn't necessarily have been an obstacle to reaching an agreement.
That's exactly right. The true obstacle, well, you might say there were two true obstacles. Jerusalem has always been a major issue, but it looked like it, and 10 or 15 years ago when Ehud Olmert was prime minister, he went very, very far to agreeing to what would be the consensus of outsiders on how you would deal with the explosive issue of Jerusalem, which is basically to divide it into West Jerusalem, which was primarily Jewish, and East Jerusalem, which was primarily Palestinian, and also allow the Palestinians to have their capital in East Jerusalem. So Jerusalem was long considered the two issues that were considered to be the deal breakers were Jerusalem and the refugees. But we know that by 10 or 15 years ago, these were no longer obstacles. Israel was, at least Olmert, the prime minister, was prepared to accept the division of Jerusalem, and the Palestinian negotiators were down to saying, well, can we have 15,000 people return, or could it be 50,000? And Olmert himself says if we had continued the negotiations, we would have reached a compromise on that. The real issue is that the rest of the West Bank has been increasingly occupied by Israeli settlers, most of them fanatics who will not accept Palestinian rule and are prepared to be violent in order to prevent it. So the real issue is since the outset of it, the real issue has been the occupation of Arab territory by Israel, its refusal to withdraw, and its refusal to allow the Palestinians to have a state. I mean, I would highlight that. Israel will not allow the Palestinians to have a state, no matter how weak and demilitarized it would be. And in the negotiations that seemed to come closer to reaching an agreement, the Palestinians accepted that there would be only allowed minimal armaments sufficient to preserve internal order, but in no way powerful enough to threaten Israeli security. Security for Israel is not really the issue. It is control of the areas that they conquered in 1967.
Yeah. It certainly seems today as if security was the issue, you would not try to maintain the occupation at all costs, because, as you pointed out, it actually endangers Israel's security and threatens it.
Yeah. What could be more obvious than this Hamas attack which stems from the continued Israeli de facto occupation of Gaza, control of Gaza? Well, I'm just agreeing with what you said, that occupation and repression leads to uprisings and revolution, not just in Israel and not just in the Middle East. Important to say that, and you pointed this out earlier, that this has been predicted repeatedly by high Israeli officials, including leader after leader of the two major intelligence organizations, Shin Bet and Mossad, who have been saying not only will occupation and repression lead to an uprising, but it's disgraceful morally.
Right. So yes, we haven't even gotten to that.
Because they say this after they're out of power. And of course, you'll find the same analyses among Israeli historians and journalists and so on and so on.
Yeah, I want to just read a short passage from your summary and conclusion section that highlights what a sort of tragedy this is. I mean, we think of this as an intractable conflict, but you say, since 1947, Israel has fought 8 to 10 wars against the Arab states and the Palestinians. None of them, probably not even the 1948 war, was unavoidable. Israel's independence and security could have been protected had it accepted reasonable compromises on the four crucial issues: partition of the historic land of Palestine, Palestinian independence and sovereignty in the land allotted to them in the 1947 UN partition plan, including Arab East Jerusalem, the return of most of the territory captured in the Arab states in the various wars, and a small-scale symbolic return to Israel of some 10,000 to 20,000 Palestinian refugees or their descendants from the 1948 war. Throughout most of the conflict, all the key Arab states and the most important Palestinian leaders were or soon became willing to reach peace with Israel if it accepted these compromises. Had it done so, there would have been few, if any, wars, justice would have prevailed, and Israel's independence and security would have been greatly enhanced. So that is a history of 70 years of avoidable tragedy.
Right. Well, yes, I stand by that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure. Do you have a question on that, or
I'd just like you to comment on that.
Okay. No, I have nothing to add to that. Unfortunately, as we see now, I think the accuracy of that statement, I stand by it.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to read it because you did, say this a few years ago. I want to ask you about, your book centers on mythologies. You start by saying that every nation has a narrative or stories about its history that are instilled into its citizens. And, you devote most of the book to examining mythologies, and you argue at various points that until mythologies are understood for what they are, it's going to be very hard to reach a resolution to this conflict. So can you talk about what you mean by these destructive mythologies?
Well, certainly the main mythology is rooted in Zionism, the argument that the Bible, God promised Palestine to the Jews and only to the Jews. And that's an argument that's going to be convincing only to those who are religiously find that argument based on religion to be acceptable. Because what we know is that for at least 2,000 years, beginning with the expulsion of the Jews by the Romans 2,000 years ago, that Palestine, where it occupied is too strong, has been the home of a variety of people, a tiny handful of them being Jewish, most of them not. When you have 2,000 years of another country, even if it were true that let's say that the Jews were driven out by the Romans, and by the way, that whole biblical story is questioned in a variety of ways by Israeli anthropologists who find very little evidence for a big kingdom of King David, et cetera, et cetera. So trying to think what I want to say here, that even if it was the case that there was a Jewish control of most of Palestine 2,000 years ago, from which they were driven out, that doesn't mean that they can go back again. If that were a general principle, it would have to apply globally, that all people who at one time or another controlled the territory must be given it back. So we would have to give back most of the United States to begin with, and so on. So that after some period of time, it's hard to be exact about this, but after some reasonable period of time, a new reality, a moral reality and a political reality emerges. I mean, land and territory, of course, in this world, unfortunately, are constantly changing hands by violence. After a while, there's a new status quo. So the Israelis have never been willing to agree that. They refuse to even recognize that the Palestinians have a right to a state of their own. I mean, Golda Meir used to say there's no such thing as Palestinians, and so on. So that's the central issue.
So, this sort of founding mythology here, I think you go through all of the different arguments for Zionism, and you say that all of the Zionist arguments for a creation of a Jewish state in Palestine and only in Palestine were unconvincing, save the argument of existential necessity. That is to say, you couldn't really argue that there was a right to establish a Jewish state and expel all the Palestinians. You might be able to argue that in the aftermath of the Holocaust, there was a just claim to establishing Israel. And in fact, that you say might make the case for it a strong one. But you point out that I'll just quote you here, a grave injustice to the Palestinians was unavoidable. That is to say that from the outset, the implementation of Zionism, that is the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine, necessarily involved I mean, this idea that Zionism was not really possible without an injustice to Palestinians from the outset. Is that right?
Actually, I don't think so. First of all, let me say this. I think that although there are many arguments from Zionism based on alleged biblical history, based on non-biblical history, based on the idea that the Jews and only the Jews must always rule, all of those arguments are entirely unconvincing. But then there's only one argument that's convincing, and it's both necessary and sufficient, that the Jews needed a state of their own. The history of murderous anti-Semitism, which preceded the Holocaust, but certainly in the wake of the Holocaust, made the need for a Jewish state imperative and morally right. And not only that, I would say that I still believe that the Jews need a state of their own. We Jews need a state of our own, because you can never be sure when murderous anti-Semitism is going to reappear. However, if you go back to the United Nations creation of Israel, Israel was given some part of ancient Palestine, and the Arabs, an Arab state, unspecified who they would be given the rest of historic Palestine. Now, in my view, the Israelis should have accepted that. And had they accepted that and stopped expanding, there might well have been a permanent peace imposed by the United Nations. But Israel immediately set out to conquer large parts of Palestine, which had been allocated to the Arabs. So the first expansion took place almost immediately. But then you have the 1956 and 1967 wars, where Israel captured large parts of Syrian, Jordanian, and Egyptian territory, most of which it refused to give back. So you have a steady expansion of Israeli control over areas and a refusal to withdraw from at least some part of it so that there could be a viable Palestinian state.
Yeah. Can I ask you, though, because many people may have heard it the opposite way to the way that you just described, because one of the mythologies that you're dealing with in the book is the idea that it was the Arabs who refused to accept the UN partition plan and immediately went to war against Israel and refused to accept the creation of a Jewish state from the outset. So why is that slightly backwards?
Well, it's slightly backwards because the myth is that the Arabs refused to accept the partition, but the Jews did. So therefore, everything that happened afterward was the fault of the Arabs. I mean, even if that were true, it wouldn't mean that 75 years later that it's only the Arabs who are an obstacle to peace. But at the time, I mean, this is well documented. It's not open to question. David Ben-Gurion, the unquestioned leader of Zionists and early Israelis, said explicitly that we have to accept a small slice of Palestine because we have no choice. We're not strong enough at this point to do anything about it. So let's go ahead and agree to the UN partition, and in time, we will regain the rest of Palestine. If we can do it politically, fine, but if necessary, we'll do it by force. So it was an acceptance, in quotes, with their fingers crossed behind their backs, that they wouldn't live with a smaller Israel. Now, I can't go into detail here, but right. What was interesting to me was the argument, Ben-Gurion's argument, among other things, was that, a small state would be indefensible and so on, but if you're going to have a Jewish state, he just picked this number, 80% of it would have to be, we could live with 20% of Arabs in a Jewish state, and we need 80% control. And so he said, therefore, we have to conquer the rest of this territory so that we can increase the percentage of Jews. But what I show, I think successfully, in the book is that if the Jews had genuinely accepted the 1948 partition, the compromise, the birth rates and immigration would have led there to be an 80% majority within about 4 or 5 years. So they didn't need to conquer other areas where there were Jewish settlements in order to reach that figure. I haven't seen anybody else make that argument. On the other hand, I haven't seen anybody challenge my assessment.
I want to turn to contemporary mythologies because we have recently seen this devastating and brutal Hamas attack on Israeli targets, including many civilians, and now we are seeing a massive Israeli reprisal in Gaza. Now, some people might say that, and I'm sure do say, that Hamas's recent attack is confirmation of one of the stories that you regard as mythology. That is to say that Hamas is bent on the destruction of Israel, won't stop until it destroys Israel, and the only option is there is no possibility of negotiating with people who are motivated by pure hatred and a desire to end Israel and wipe it off the map. How would you respond to someone who says that the recent events actually confirm what you regard as the mythology?
Well, I'm going to answer that in two parts. And in the first part, I go in great detail in my book to a number of efforts by Hamas to initiate negotiations with Israel. Basically, by the 1980s or so, both Hamas and Arafat and the PLO had accepted that they could not destroy Israel, that the best they could do would be to get a Palestinian state on territory, particularly in the West Bank and Gaza. And there were many efforts by Hamas leaders and that, look, let's enter into negotiations. We'll have a 20-year truce, so on and so forth. And Israel refused to talk to. I have a very good quote, which I think is going to three quotes. I say, this is on page 288, that although there was some ambivalence about Hamas, they'd say one thing that seemed to be peaceful one day, and then they would say something militant another day. There's inconsistencies and so on. But this is how I conclude. I said, yet the overall evolution of Hamas's policies was unmistakable. And I go into to what was said by leading Israelis at the time about the changes in Hamas. Among other things, they officially eliminated their charter, which was highly anti-Semitic, and replaced it with one which was anti-Zionist and so on, and in various ways was much more moderate, still quite religious and so on. So the charter changed and the policies changed and so on. In late 2006, Yossi Alfa, a former deputy head of the Mossad, wrote, Hamas's conditions are almost too good to be true. Refugees and the right of return in Jerusalem can wait for some other process. Hamas will suffice with the 1967 borders, more or less, and in return will guarantee peace and quiet for 10, 25, or 30 years of good neighborly relations. Similarly, in 2009, Ephraim Halevi, former head of the Mossad, and then the national security advisor to Ariel Sharon, of all people, wrote that Hamas militants have recognized their ideological goal is not attainable and will not be in the foreseeable future. Instead, they are ready and willing to see the establishment of a Palestinian state in the temporary borders of 1967. Halevi concluded dryly that, quote, Israel, for reasons of its own, did not want to turn the ceasefire into the start of a diplomatic process with Hamas. Last thing, Ami Alon, former head of the Shin Bet, concurred that Hamas's policy was significantly changing. He said the resolution of an existential conflict like the conflict between us and the Palestine occurs when the dream is separated from the diplomatic plan. So you have a long history of that. Moreover, which is also very important, in the last 10 years until this recent attack, Israel has not only concurred, but helped continued Hamas rule over Gaza. The Israelis want to separate Gaza from the West Bank to make a two-state settlement even more impossible than it already is. And an agreement had been reached. I'm sure it's more than a tacit agreement. There had to have been conversations off the record that Hamas will end attacks on Israel and moreover will control and prevent attacks on Israel from more radical groups within Gaza like Islamic Jihad in return for Israel allowing it to continue to rule over Gaza. And Arab states began providing money with Israelis' permission in the last couple of years to shore up Hamas rule. So until this latest horrendous attack by Hamas, there was a de facto agreement that seemed to stabilize the situation. Now, nobody predicted that it would lead to this kind of conflict. And partly the reason no one predicted it is that the Hamas leaders seemed to be reasonably moderate. And all of a sudden you have these suicidal maniacs who attack Israel. I don't understand how that could have happened. I suppose what happened is that the fanatics within Hamas gain control over Hamas, because otherwise you can make, you can have sort of make a general assessment that conditions are such that sooner or later there's going to be an attack. But nobody predicted this kind of attack, and nobody predicted it because it was basically unpredictable. I mean, it's inconsistent with what Hamas has been for the last 20 or 30 years.
So you're suggesting there that the moderating tendencies, or the appearance of moderating tendencies within Hamas that was noted in the quotes that you have between 2006 and 2010 was quite real, but because that opportunity was not taken to deal with these people, they may have empowered the fanatics who said, well, essentially, we have nothing to lose here. We're never going to get a Palestinian state. The settlements are going to continue to expand in the West Bank, Gaza. I mean, it looks like was going to remain under de facto Israeli control indefinitely. I mean, as we looked out into the future before these attacks, it seemed like, as you point out in the book, Israel's policy was essentially maintain the status quo, and the status quo was going to be deeply unjust to Palestinians.
Yeah, but Hamas was, the more important point is Hamas, by its agreement to end terrorist attacks on Israel and prevent others from engaging in terrorist attacks, they accepted in practice, if not rhetorically, they accepted that, okay, if you let us rule over Gaza, we won't attack Israel. Now, they also want to rule over West Bank. There certainly could have been a conflict between the Palestinians in the West Bank, or the Palestinian leadership in the West Bank, and Hamas eventually. So it wasn't only Israel, it was also Hamas, which accepted that there was not going to be a Palestinian state. And of course, they knew that if they tried, the judgment Hamas leaders were making, not the terrorists now, but the leaders were making, was that if we attack Israel, we're going to be bombarded and repressed, and there's going to be huge casualties. And that happened. It's happened 3 or 4 times. This is not the first time that Israel has bombed Gaza. And if they go in, it won't be the first time they send troops in there. Well, after 3 or 4 of these things, Hamas apparently, seemingly came to the conclusion that there was no point, there was everything to lose and nothing to gain by continuing quixotic attacks on Israel. So all of that now has been blown up by the attack of these Hamas fanatics. How this is to be explained in light of what Hamas had apparently been willing to accept, we don't know. Possibly that simply there's a group of fanatics in it who were not under the control of the Hamas leaders. It'd be very hard for me to believe. It would be very hard to understand if the Hamas leadership, the political leadership, said, yes, let's support this attack. There was a 100% certainty that if there was this kind of attack, the worst terrorist attack on Israel, and these murderous fanatics slaughtering innocent people and so on, they had to know with 100% certainty that there's going to be a massive Israeli response. So why did it occur? We don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. I mean, it does look suicidal, right? I mean, it looks bizarre in a certain way.
It's literally suicidal because the 1,500 or so Hamas fighters that went into Israel had to know they were not going to get out of Israel, that there's going to be that they're going to be hunted down and killed. So they were suicidal. It's fanatical, suicidal terrorism at its worst. And they also had to know that the killing of the terrorists was going to be only the first step for a massive Israeli response, which we are already seeing, of course, in Gaza, where Israel is not only bombing, but they've cut off, imagine this, they've cut off electricity, water, and food, and they control the entry of all of those things. They've cut that off. What did these people, if they had any leaders, think was going to be the case? What Israel is doing in Gaza is unprecedented only in its extent, because there were other massive attacks on Gaza, in some cases on West Bank, after some particularly egregious terrorist attack on Israel. But these other attacks on Israel, which had led to massive Israeli responses, would be, maybe the bombing of a restaurant, 25 people are killed. That's bad enough, but it doesn't compare with what the fanatics did this time.
Yeah, and so I don't know if you've had a chance to think about or whether there is any answer to this question. Would you concur that this is kind of the bleakest moment for the Israel-Palestine conflict since, maybe since the start? I mean, certainly it's a moment where it seems like certainly the prospect of a Palestinian state has entirely collapsed and had collapsed already before this recent attack. As you point out in the book, Israeli public opinion had turned against it, and there really seemed like no chance in the near future for a just settlement to the crisis. I mean, are we in the most dire moment that we've been in?
Yes, I think so. And I also think that prospects for any kind of political settlement are zero. They weren't much more than zero before this, but they certainly are zero now. I absolutely cannot see how anything good can come out of this. I think Israel now, I agree with the Israelis that they now have to destroy Hamas. But it's an impossible moral dilemma because the only way of destroying Hamas is to go into Gaza. And that's going to lead, it already has led to hundreds of thousands of casualties. And each day that goes by with more bombing and no or very little food and water, very little electricity, and so on, that there's going to be enormous civilian casualties. So it's an impossible situation. I can't see anything but more tragedy coming out of this. I hate to say that, but that's my view. And even before this attack, I thought the chances of a political settlement were hopeless, not because of Hamas, but because Israel simply was not going to remove its settlers from the West Bank. It was going to do just the opposite. It was going to expand it, and that's what's going to happen in the West Bank as well. So Israeli control is going to continue. Who knows what they'll do in Gaza, whether they will try to occupy it or more or less level it and then leave. Whatever they do is going to be bad, even though it is necessary to destroy Hamas. That's the dilemma. It just simply is horrible.
Well, you discuss extensively in the book the role of the United States, and you do argue that the U.S. failure to put sufficient pressure on Israel to abandon some of these refusals to make reasonable concessions has been part of why the opportunities were missed to resolve the conflict. Let me ask you this then, in this present moment, what do you think the United States government ought to be doing to minimize the tragedy unfolding?
Well, what it ought to do is to stop placing the entire responsibility on the Palestinians or even on Hamas. That it ought to be somehow using its. I don't think it can do this. I think in principle they should be taking whatever steps they can to stop Israel from continuing to attack the civilian population in Palestine. I think that the Biden administration is not happy. There are signs that Israel is doing this, but they don't feel that they can exert pressure. And they may not even be able to successfully exert pressure. Mm-hmm. Right now, it's hard to know what the United States can do. But I don't like Biden's rhetoric, which places the entire responsibility for the overall conflict on Israel. He shouldn't be saying that. He should be saying something along the lines of that this is a tragedy in which both sides have played a role, and it's time to end that. And further, I make this argument in the book, even if you have a change of rhetorical policy on the part of the United States, or even going beyond that, if the United States threatened to cut off military assistance to Israel unless it did A, B, and C, there'd be a very good chance that the Israelis would say, go to hell, we're not going to do it. They've got enough arms of their own and so on. But the rhetoric is bad by the United States. I mean, all of it, American, Blinken and Sullivan and all the rest of them, and Biden, of course, should be at least rhetorically recognizing the complexity of the situation. They can say Hamas, of course, has to go, and I agree with that. But Israel has to be prepared to reach a political settlement with the Palestinians, something along those lines.
Yeah.
But they're not going to say that, both because they probably don't understand the extent to which Israel has been the obstacle to this, and also for the obvious political reasons.
Yeah. And it would also be helpful if Israel were told that compliance with international law is not optional, right?
Yes, absolutely. That's the kind of things which should be being said and are not, and almost certainly will not. I think that there will be pressure from the United States. I'm not sure whether the pressure would be anything more than behind-the-scenes rhetoric that if the worst comes to worst and the Israelis and this attacks in Gaza continue and escalate. I read today the Israelis are telling the residents of Gaza to get up and move to the south. That if this continues to go on, that probably the American government is going to be hoping that Israel will stop. And I think you'll see rhetoric, or you'll see stories that behind the scenes the United States is trying to exercise not pressure, but influence to prevent that. But Israel, in the past, has ignored those kinds of pressures, not pressures even, ignored the kind of hopeful rhetoric and so on. So it's hard to see how this is going to end.
Well, Professor Jerome Slater, we thank you for joining us today. The book, as I say, is Mythologies Without End, the U.S., Israel, and the Arab-Israeli Conflict 1917 through 2020, available from Oxford University Press. And as I indicated at the outset, I really do think there is no better one-volume, comprehensive, encyclopedic summary of everything we've gotten to up until this point, but you pack a lot into its pages, and so anyone who wants to be educated on the background of the conflict should pick up Mythologies Without End. Professor Jerome Slater, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.